Good morning. Welcome to the Gordon Current Science and Technology stage. I'm Julia, and this is a science snapshot presentation. This one is genetically modified foods. So I'm going to give you some background about why foods get genetically modified and define that for you. And then we will look at some of the questions surrounding genetically modified foods. All right. So first, why this happens. And the objective is pretty much improving crops, but improving means different things to different people. But in general, wouldn't it be good if crops could produce more on the same area of land, could grow year-round, could taste better, could look better, could have a longer shelf life, last longer, be more nutritious? It would be great if our foods could be improved in these ways. Also, from the point of view of a farmer growing the food, it'd be nice if the plants could resist disease better, resist pests like bugs, and resist drought and other environmental challenges. So it would be great if we could do that, and it would be great if we could do that without spraying all kinds of chemicals on the crops, which can lead to harm to the environment. So before genetic engineering was a thing, people were already genetically modifying foods in a way, and it was through breeding, selective breeding. So here's a great example of that. Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in about 1970 because he did some work developing a new type of wheat. So at that time, there were huge famines, hunger crises in Africa, for example, and he developed a wheat that was resistant to some diseases that were affecting those areas, and a wheat that also produced a high yield of grain, and it worked great, and it made a huge difference for many, many people, so he earned the Peace Prize. And he did all this by just selecting plants and breeding the ones with the right characteristics with each other. It takes a long time, many, many, many generations of plants and a lot of testing. Genetic engineering of a food is sort of the same thing, but way faster, and there is a special difference that really is showing up these days. Here, let's look at genes and DNA real quick. This is a model you might have seen representing a little segment of DNA. That's the molecule with the code for all of the instructions for making proteins and all the functions that happen in a human body or a plant or any living thing. So let's say you're a farmer. You may not know about DNA, but you do know that you're growing some corn crops, and you notice that this corn plant doesn't grow as many ears of corn, and this corn plant grows more ears of corn. Now, behind the scenes, there is a difference in the DNA of the corn. See, this one is colored different. So the idea is there's a different gene here. But from your point of view, all you know is, I like that corn better. So this corn, I'm not going to collect its seed to grow next year. I'm going to save the seed from this corn. So that's sort of like selective breeding. And in a moment, we will genetically engineer this corn. I use the word genetically modified. You might have heard this, a lot of other phrases applied to this. Genetically engineered foods, bioengineered foods, transgenic foods. And I'm just talking about foods or ingredients that have genes added to their DNA, and those genes can come from other organisms, including other species. DNA is a really long molecule, and sections of it are called genes, and each gene kind of codes for a particular molecule or a particular job. So now we're going to look at the most popular genes that they insert into food crops. We've got the top 3 crops that get genetically modified are cotton, soybeans, and corn. This is in the United States. I'm really focused on the United States in this talk. You can see about 90% of those crops grown here are genetically modified. Now, where do these things end up? Where does this food go? Most of it gets fed to livestock, like cattle and chickens and pigs and stuff. Some of it gets used to make biofuels, like ethanol. And then another portion of it goes to processed foods. I use this one because I'm using corn as my example. So corn chips, I ate a bunch of these this week. They're totally made with genetically modified corn. The genes that they're putting into these crops have two big objectives, and both of these make it easier for the farmers. They don't have a direct effect on like the nutrition or the look or taste of the food for us consumers, but for the farmers, these genes will help the plants tolerate weed killers and kill off insects. So, tolerate weed killer. If you've had a garden with weeds, then you've probably pulled the weeds out by hand, or maybe you squirted some weed killer just on the spots where the weeds are. If you squirt it on your flowers, the flowers will get damaged. But the idea here is developing a crop that can survive being sprayed with weed killers, so you can just spray your whole field and just the weeds will die. And this is supposed to be good because it's supposed to limit how many chemicals and how many different weed killers get sprayed. And when you don't have to till the soil, it reduces erosion. So where'd they get this gene? They got it from a bacterium. That lives in the soil, but the bacterium with this particular gene, I read that it came from an area that had residue of this weed killer. So it's possible that these bacteria had evolved to tolerate the weed killer from being exposed to it. Then what researchers did is they identified the gene in the bacterium that makes it resist weed killer. In this case, it's the yellow one. And then they made a lot of copies of that gene, and then they insert that gene into the DNA of the corn. And that's a several step process. I'm definitely simplifying it here, but you do break the DNA at a spot, and then you add the DNA you want, and then you make it knit back together. Haha, now our corn is genetically engineered, and now it has this gene that lets it resist weed killer. And I'm happy to talk about more details of how that works after the show. And the other gene that's been really popular to be added, it comes from a slightly different bacterium, but it's the same process I just showed you. And this one, the bacterium makes an insecticide. It makes a chemical that is poisonous to certain kinds of caterpillars that eat the crops. And there's some specific to cotton and some specific to corn. And they have genetically modified cotton and corn to produce this insect-killing chemical in the tissue of the plant. This chemical we already were using in agriculture for many years as a spray. So we spray the insecticide, and that was how they prevented these caterpillars from eating up all their plants. Now, instead of having to spray, the plant itself contains that chemical, a tiny bit of it, in the tissue. That includes the part that we eat, but it's mostly in the stems. So there you go. It's the same chemical. We're not necessarily eating a greater quantity of it now, but the chemical is being produced by the plant itself instead of having to be sprayed. One possible benefit is that there's not spray running off and polluting the environment. All right. So there's a lot of other genetically modified foods in the works, but I think that I want to look at some of these questions that are important to people. A big question is, are they safe to eat? And I think that's because when you hear genetically modified, you think unnatural. Is that a common sentiment? But these have been studied. A lot of the studies are sponsored by the companies that make the genetically modified foods, so that's important to keep in mind. And some of the studies are led by like government agencies, for example. And so far, most studies suggest that they are safe to eat. They are nutritionally the same as the regular. So genetically modified corn has all the same amount of vitamins and minerals and stuff as regular corn. They test for all the allergens that they know how to test for, and they have not found any allergens. And I show this picture of animals because there are studies with animal feeding that have suggested that genetically modified foods could cause some health problems. But the thing is, each of those studies is only a single study. So like when they saw a study with pigs, they had 20 or so pigs, and the ones that ate the genetically modified soybeans had a higher incidence of severe inflammation in their stomach. That is worth looking at more, right? It's like that study doesn't prove that genetically modified soybean hurts you, but it does say, whoa, this is a question we should look at more. We should do another study. We should use more pigs. We should, control for other variables the best we can. So my point is, I'm not discounting the studies that question the effects on health, but we need more data. And ideally, we need more data collected by people that are not being paid by the companies that make genetically modified food. That's a challenge with the research. Okay, another question, could they spread and affect the environment? Yes, some of them certainly can. We've already seen evidence that genetically modified wheat that has never been approved for marketing was found by surprise in a field in Oregon where it was not planted. So, it makes sense. Pollen can easily blow on the wind. So we haven't seen evidence of huge problems with this yet, but we do see that this stuff can move around, and we have a lot of questions left unanswered about how far those effects could go. And there's a lot of stuff related to business. So these genetically modified foods, they are benefiting from some support from the government and stuff. So they end up, a lot of those foods are cheaper to make and sell. So that's why my junk food has genetically modified corn in it, because it's cheaper. So could that hurt the business of smaller farmers? The companies own these plants and animals that they genetically engineer. So before we added this yellow gene, this corn was just corn. Nobody owns that. But after this gene was added, the corn and all the seeds from this corn would belong to the company that developed the method to make this corn. So big biotech companies own these plants and animals, and when farmers use them, they sign an agreement. For example, you agree not to save seed to plant the next year. You're supposed to buy a new seed to plant each year because the company owns it. You're also not supposed to share seed with people for research, which is a challenge for researchers. They have to do some, it can be a lot of work just to get access to the seeds they want to study. And then imagine you are a farmer, let's say you are growing organic wheat. So in the United States, USDA organic includes non-GMO, non-genetically modified organisms. So if you see USDA organic on a label in the United States, that means that there are no genetically modified ingredients in that food. It's whether something's genetically modified and whether it's organically grown are actually separate. And the labeling in the United States is kind of confusing and mushes them together. I'm happy to explain that more afterward. But here, let's just say you are growing a non-genetically modified crop, but someone a couple miles away is growing the genetically modified kind. And what if pollen from there accidentally gets in your field? Oh dear, now you have genetically modified crop. One thing is you could lose your organic certification. So that would be a problem. And the other thing is, it is possible, although there are not really very many examples of this, it is possible that the company that owns the genetically modified seed could sue you for growing it without their permission, even though it was a total accident. So those kind of scenarios have some people worried, but again, there aren't really any examples of this. but there is fear. I have read about people fearing that that could impact small farmers. So after all that, what about any benefit to us? Genetically modified foods, we've heard about how it makes it easier to use weed killer and stuff, but what about, does it make food cheaper or better for us? And the answer is that those kinds of approaches are being developed. There are definitely genetically modified foods being developed for nutrition and stuff, but right now, the ones that are in use and have been in use for many years are the ones that mostly help the farmers, especially large-scale farming. So that happens to be where the benefits are right now, but there is real potential for other benefits as well. So we're almost out of time, but I wanted to show you that we are almost there in having the first genetically modified animal food in the United States, and it will probably be approved, and it is a salmon. So the company is called Aqua Bounty, and it's actually in Massachusetts. So here is a regular salmon, 18 months old. Here is an Aqua Advantage salmon, 18 months old. So you see the difference? This guy grows a lot faster. The way they did that was they added genes from a couple other species of fish to this that encourages it to grow. They have done a lot of work to make sure that this kind of fish won't get into the environment, because these guys eat really fast, right? If you had a bunch of these in the ocean, they might outcompete the natural fish. Well, here's the precautions they take. One is these are intended to grow in indoor tanks, so it's for fish farming indoors with no contact with the ocean. Second, all the fish they produce are all female and sterile. So the Aqua Bounty makes the eggs of the fish, and then you buy the eggs and grow the fish. So female, sterile. So if it did escape, it could not breed. So they are trying to pay attention to all those questions. Okay, what about nutrition and taste? They say that it does taste the same as regular salmon. It is nutritionally totally the same. So when it gets approved, it'll take years for this to come into wider use. In fact, economically, I still don't see how this is going to become a very popular way to grow salmon. But if it does, here's my other question: will it be labeled? In the United States, genetically modified foods don't have to be labeled. That's why the only time that you really know that there's nothing genetically modified in your food is if it also has the organic label. It's very confusing. So other countries don't do it this way. There are other countries that require labeling. There are other countries that don't even import genetically modified foods at all. Should they be labeled? This is a big argument. And the industry side says labeling them would be misleading, and it would affect people's buying choices. And that shouldn't happen because genetically modified foods are nutritionally the same as regular food. And I say, okay, but it's obviously different enough that the companies can own the genetically modified plant. If it's different enough that a company can own it, why isn't it different enough that you should label it? And then there are people that have a strong opinion that we should know exactly what we are eating. And my last thing is just, what do you think? I would be happy to chat with you. How many of you think they should label genetically modified foods? Yeah. Just labeling, right? That would be very helpful. For example, it would help us track possible health impacts, right? Right now, if you develop some health condition, you can't. There is no way to tell whether it was related to genetically modified foods because they weren't labeled, so you didn't know whether you ate them. So just things like that. It would be good. It would help us collect more data, and that's what we need. So I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I want to thank you for joining me. Have a great day at the Museum of Science. Thanks.